The War Council chamber smelled of gunpowder and tobacco smoke, a suffocating blend that clung to the heavy oak walls. Maps covered the long table, littered with markers that represented men, red pins for the enemy, blue for their own. Every general seated there bore the weight of campaigns etched into their faces, their medals gleaming under the low light. This was a room for men who had clawed their way to command through decades of battle. And at the far end, almost out of place, sat her. She wore no ribbons. No brass-plated honors, only a plain uniform and a calm expression that betrayed neither fear nor arrogance. She was younger than most of the officers' daughters, her dark hair tied back neatly, her notes organized with meticulous care. She didn't belong in their eyes, and the smirks around the table said as much. The commander at the head cleared his throat. We're facing 50,000 troops advancing from the eastern ridge. Our forces are half that number. Suggestions? One by one, generals laid out their ideas: frontal assaults, reinforcements, trench defenses. Each plan bled men by the thousands. Each plan sounded like desperation disguised as strategy. Finally, the commander turned to her. Lieutenant, you've been quiet. You studied these maps all week. Speak. She rose slowly, her hands steady as she adjusted the map markers. We don't fight them head-on. We let them fight shadows. We cut their supply lines here, here, and here. She tapped 3 points on the map: railroads, rivers, and a depot. We stage false camps at the northern valley, spread false transmissions over the radio, and use controlled demolitions to make them believe they're being flanked. By morning, they'll collapse into retreat without knowing where the threat is. For a moment, silence hung in the air, and then laughter. A broad-chested general slammed the table, wheezing. You think we can scare 50,000 men away with shadows? Girl, this is war, not theater. Another smirked. Maybe she thinks the enemy will faint if we whisper loud enough. The room filled with chuckles, derision dripping from every voice. She stood quietly, absorbing every insult, her face unreadable. The commander didn't laugh. He studied her, his weathered eyes narrowing, the flicker of curiosity tugging at his doubt. She finally spoke again, her tone calm but razor-sharp. You laugh because you still believe wars are won by numbers. But numbers mean nothing if men don't know where to march, what to eat, or who commands them. You want to fight an army. I want to erase one. The laughter faltered. In that moment, a seed of unease planted itself in the minds of even her loudest critics. They dismissed her words, but they couldn't shake the chill her conviction carried. By dawn, they would learn just how wrong they were. From the moment she entered the council chamber, she knew she was unwelcome. The room wasn't designed for someone like her. The walls were lined with portraits of past generals, stern-faced men in ceremonial dress, each painted with a sword or medal in hand. No woman's eyes stared back from those frames, no young lieutenant without scars of battle. She felt their absence like an invisible weight pressing against her shoulders. The others made no effort to hide their disdain. Some refused to look at her at all, scribbling in their notebooks as if she were a clerk there to fetch water. Others glanced her way only to smirk, silently amused at the novelty of her presence. She knew why she was there, not because they respected her, but because one stubborn commander had insisted she be allowed to present her analysis. A test, really. If she failed, it would justify their belief that strategy belonged only to those who had bled for it in the mud of battlefields. If she succeeded, few of them intended to give her the credit. She listened carefully as the men around the table laid out their plans: fortify the ridges, bring in reinforcements from the southern flank, launch an immediate offensive before the enemy reaches the river. Every suggestion cost lives, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. Yet each man spoke with the certainty of someone used to commanding without question. Their strategies were old, blunt, and predictable. When her turn came, she felt the weight of every eye. She rose, adjusting the edges of the map with deliberate calm. Her voice didn't rise, didn't tremble, it flowed with steady confidence. She pointed out choke points, railroads, bridges, and the supply depot that fed the enemy army like arteries feeding a beast. She explained the use of misinformation, decoys, and sabotage, how they could trick the enemy into believing a phantom army surrounded them. It was bold. It was new. It was everything the others weren't ready to hear. The mockery was immediate. A brigadier snorted so loudly it echoed off the oak walls. You propose fairy tales and shadows. Madness, another scoffed. This is war, not a stage play. She speaks like a professor, not a soldier, muttered a colonel. The enemy will eat us alive. The laughter cut sharper than any blade. She stood motionless, her hands folded neatly behind her back. To react was to lose. To stay silent was to let their doubt fuel itself. Only one man didn't laugh. The commander. He leaned forward, his chin resting on his clasped hands, his eyes locked on her. Unlike the others, he had no smirk, no mocking gleam. He'd seen too many battles lost by arrogance to laugh at anyone bold enough to think differently. When the council adjourned, the generals marched out, still grumbling about wasted time. She stayed behind, gathering her notes, her composure unshaken. As she turned to leave, the commander spoke. You're either brilliant, he said quietly, or reckless. Her gaze met his without flinching. Sometimes they are the same thing. For the first time that night, he allowed himself the faintest smile. The War Council had dissolved into mutters and scoffs, but her words lingered like smoke in the commander's mind. He sat alone after the chamber emptied, staring at the map with its clusters of red pins. 50,000 enemy troops. If the other generals were right, the battle would be bloody, costly, and far from certain. But if she was right, the next morning she was summoned to his office. Unlike the council chamber, the room was quiet, stripped of pomp. Just books, a desk, and a man who had seen too many wars. Explain it again, he said. She did. Methodically, without emotion. She spoke of cutting supply lines with surgical precision. Railroads sabotaged, bridges collapsed at key intervals, and depots burned. She explained the art of deception. Dummy camps lit by fires, radio chatter scripted to suggest reinforcements, whispers of phantom battalions. Psychological warfare, not brute force. You don't defeat 50,000 men, she said firmly. You make them believe they've already been defeated. The commander leaned back in his chair, his jaw tense. They'll laugh me out of my own army if I back this. Then don't tell them, she replied simply. It was reckless advice, but he knew she was right. War didn't care about pride, it cared about results. By nightfall, her plan was quietly approved. She was given a small, specialized team, saboteurs, engineers, signal operators. No banners, no fanfare. While the rest of the army prepared for a bloody confrontation, she slipped into the shadows, her operation cloaked under the pretense of support maneuvers. The mocking whispers didn't stop. In the mess hall, officers chuckled about the little strategist with her ghost army. Soldiers joked that she was probably building scarecrows to frighten the enemy. None of them knew the scope of her design, or the precision required to pull it off. The first move came at midnight. Teams crept along the rail lines that fed the enemy's advance. Charges were set, bridges collapsed silently into rivers, trains filled with supplies derailed in the dark. By dawn, the enemy's arteries were cut, but they didn't yet know it. The second move unfolded in the valley north of the ridge. Her decoy camp blazed with hundreds of fires, tents raised in neat formations, silhouettes of soldiers crafted from simple cloth and sticks. Radio operators broadcast false chatter, calls for reinforcements, coded messages suggesting entire battalions were on the march. The signals were designed to be intercepted, each transmission feeding the enemy's growing unease. Meanwhile, saboteurs targeted depots. Fuel reserves erupted in flames. Ammunition caches vanished in controlled detonations that lit the night sky like fireworks. The enemy saw smoke but no attackers. Panic stirred in their ranks. Back at headquarters, the generals scoffed. Reports of sabotage trickled in, and they dismissed them as annoyances. But the commander, watching her work unfold, began to see the pattern, the invisible net tightening around 50,000 men. By the third night, enemy scouts reported movements of phantom divisions. From the valley fires to the intercepted radio chatter, every piece painted the same illusion. They were surrounded, outnumbered, their supplies dwindling. Inside the enemy camp, paranoia bloomed like disease. Officers shouted contradictory orders, soldiers whispered of ghosts in the hills, entire platoons abandoned positions under the cover of darkness. The army that had marched forward with confidence now stumbled in confusion. And still, her critics laughed. They didn't see the cracks forming in the enemy's resolve. They didn't hear the intercepted, panicked transmissions, the pleas for reinforcements that would never come. The commander visited her late one evening as she reviewed maps by lantern light. They still don't believe you, he said quietly. She didn't look up. They don't need to. The enemy does. By then, even he couldn't deny it. Something extraordinary was happening. 50,000 men were slipping into the shadows not from battle, but from fear. What the generals mocked as fantasy was becoming a brutal, silent reality. And the dawn that followed would reveal the unthinkable. Night moved like a conspirator across the valley. Where daylight had revealed lines and formation, darkness turned the landscape into possibility, blank slates on which she would write a new story. The teams she'd assembled, engineers, concealment crews, signalsmen, and a handful of saboteurs, spread out in careful, quiet arcs. Their work would not be loud. It would be precise. It would be the kind of cruelty that never needed to be seen to be believed. Her orders were simple in spirit, though exacting in timing. Deny, deceive, disorient. The denial came first. Supply routes that had fed the enemy like lifelines began to falter. Trains that should have rolled through the night slowed and stalled. Convoys found their roads eaten by mud or choked by rubble. Stores of fuel and ammunition were rendered unusable, not by a frontal assault, but by the quiet interventions of hands that had been trained to break the chain without calling attention to themselves. In the dark, logistic hubs that once thrummed with industry were ghostly and still. Men waiting on the docks for crates never arrived. Kitchens went cold, the steady pulse of resupply faltered into coughing silence. Next came the deception. Decoy camps rose from the ashes of abandoned farmsteads and empty clearings. Hundreds of small fires were stoked in patterns that suggested tents and bivouacs. Dark billows of smoke were coaxed into the wind at calculated moments. The decoys were crude when seen up close: cloth, poles, empty mess tins, but from the distance of a scouting party or a single pair of binoculars, they were armies. Their purpose was simple: create credible evidence that the ground was no longer safe for a march. Signals units breathed a different kind of life into the deception. Skilled operators, versed in the language of radio and routine, fed curated transmissions into channels the enemy monitored. The voices carried the cadence of real units: routine check-ins, candid complaints about rations, calls for reinforcement. They sounded authentic because they mirrored the mundane chatter an army produces every night: small talk, boredom, fear, woven into a tapestry that suggested scale and movement. Intercepted, the chatter read as the nervous hum of an army on the move or an army under threat. To enemy ears, it created a terrible illusion of encirclement. Sabotage worked like a scalpel where denial had been a blunt instrument. Small teams moved under the cover of darkness to points where men's reliance on infrastructure was absolute: bridges, depots, rail spurs. Their work was surgical and understated. The goal was not to destroy everything in sight, but to create the precise kind of failure that bogs down an army. A bridge unusable at dawn, a culvert that washes out a road, a depot that can't be moved from without exposing men to open ground. The aftermath would look like bad luck to those not looking for the pattern. To those who understood supply, it would look like a trap closing around them. Then the controlled chaos began. Calibrated incidents staged like actors on a dark stage. At predetermined times, fires flared at a distance where campfires would be expected. At others, isolated explosions mimicked the sound of sabotage or skirmish, drawing scouts away from the main routes. False flares arced into the sky as if signaling the approach of reinforcements. The enemy scouts, suspicious and excitable, returned with grainy reports that confirmed the deception. Columns sighted on the flank, brigades preparing to cross the river, armored units massing in the valley. Each report, small by itself, fed the next. Each misstep amplified the perception of threat. Perhaps the most insidious tool she used was patience. She never sought a decisive clash. Instead, she let uncertainty take root. Commanders who could not see the outline of their enemy's strength began to doubt their own. Orders that once had been given with iron certainty came back with caveats. Reconnaissance that should have been routine now returned with contradictory assertions. Where once there had been a single coordinated push, now there were delays, subdivisions, arguments into the night. The chain of command stuttered because the chain of information had been poisoned. In the enemy headquarters, the effect was visible. A colonel, once steady and cold, pushed a cup of coffee aside and read an intercepted message twice, his jaw unhinged. Officers descended into shouting matches over radio channels, issuing contradictory directives as the phantom signals fed their fears. Patrols that had been ordered to secure positions came back early, reporting movement that proved to be nothing more than the outline of a dummy tent caught in moonlight. Men began to whisper about flanking forces that never materialized, and phantom brigades that blinked into existence on radio chatter and then were gone. Her traps were not bloodthirsty ambushes. They were openings into which the enemy walked because the world had been rearranged by uncertainty. As food became scarce and orders inconsistent, desertions crept into the margins. A regiment that had been confident at dusk found itself with frayed supply lines and alarmed scouts by dawn. Without fuel, without rails, without reliable orders, the army that had presented itself as 50,000 strong no longer had the scaffolding necessary to hold such a mass together. Units peeled off to protect their own flanks. Commanders split forces to cover phantom threats. And morale, always the fragile currency, began to vanish. There was no single dramatic battle that decided the night. There was a series of small collapses, a depot commander ordering a withdrawal when his supply train failed to arrive, a regional commander rerouting troops in response to a fake transmission and discovering an impassable river where a bridge once stood, a battalion miscounting reinforcement schedules and moving into a valley where none of the support existed. Each poor decision looked reasonable in isolation. Together they formed a cascade. At dawn, the maps showed the result. Where red had once held solid, the pins of enemy presence retreated like tide marks washed clean. Units that had been arrayed in confident lines were now scattered, regrouping, surrendering supply wagons to the nearest available authority, or quietly slipping away with their own men. 50,000 men did not die overnight. They were not annihilated. They disappeared, dispersed into confusion, retreat, and disorder, because the ground beneath them had been rendered unreliable, their lines of command poisoned, and their certainty stolen. Back at headquarters, as the light seeped into the council chamber, reports began to trickle in, columns withdrawing, notes of retreat, intercepted cries for reinforcements that would not arrive. The generals who had laughed the night before watched the pins on the map shift with hands that would not stay steady. Her plan had not been violence for its own sake. It had been a theft of certainty. She had stolen their enemy's conviction, and in doing so, removed the enemy from the board without a single pitched battle. She watched the sunrise and allowed herself for a single beat, a small, private satisfaction, not for the cleverness, but for the preservation. Thousands of lives had been spared the butchery of frontal assault. The war had been altered not with carnage, but with cunning. The shadows she had painted had done the work of armies. In the quiet that followed, the room that had once laughed at her would have to answer a new question. How do you pay respect to a strategy that never raised a flag and never demanded a hero's body? The victory was there on the map, and the silence in the chamber that morning was louder than any applause. The sun rose over the valley like a slow revelation, pulling the truth into sharp relief. What had looked like an unstoppable wall of 50,000 men only a day before was now scattered mist. From the ridgeline, scouts expected to see a sea of tents, cook fires, and orderly columns preparing for the day's march. Instead, smoke curled aimlessly from abandoned fire pits. Supply wagons stood tilted in the mud, their contents spilled or stripped. Horses wandered loose, their reins dragging. The silence was unnerving. An army that size was never quiet. To the untrained eye, it seemed as though the soldiers had simply vanished. But she knew better. They hadn't disappeared. They'd been unraveled. Throughout the night, the traps had tightened with surgical precision. Misinformation spread like wildfire, forcing commanders to divide forces to cover phantom threats. By dawn, what had been one unified army was now splintered into confused, isolated regiments, each convinced it was about to be overrun. Entire divisions had retreated miles off course, chasing shadows that didn't exist. Others had dug defensive trenches against enemies who were never coming. A few, caught between collapsed bridges and sabotaged roads, abandoned their heavy equipment altogether, choosing speed over strength. From above, it looked less like a retreat and more like a scattering of frightened birds. The enemy's high command felt the collapse long before their soldiers admitted it. Radios crackled with contradictory orders. Advance to Sector 9 in one ear, fall back and regroup in another. Officers screamed at one another, their confidence shattered by false reports of encirclement. Maps littered their war tables, pins moved frantically as if shuffling wood and metal could restore coherence. But the more they tried to impose order, the deeper the chaos spread. And then the worst happened. Silence. Entire brigades stopped responding. Convoys vanished from reports. Squadrons that should have checked in simply didn't. To a commander, silence is louder than any explosion. Silence means you no longer have an army. What broke them wasn't just supply shortages or sabotage, it was fear. Soldiers began whispering that they were surrounded by a force 3 times their size. Some swore they'd seen enemy tanks cresting hills in the moonlight, even though none were there. When men believe they are already defeated, it doesn't matter whether the enemy is real or not. Paranoia spreads faster than any bullet. And by the time the first deserters slipped away into the forests, the entire war machine was already hollowed out. At her headquarters, the generals who had doubted her gathered in stunned silence. Reports flooded in, enemy units abandoning positions, whole columns retreating in disorder. Prisoners taken in the night told the same story again and again. "We thought you were everywhere. We thought we had no chance." She stood over the map, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her lips. Not because she enjoyed humiliation, but because her plan had worked without the slaughter the others had insisted was necessary. She had given them a victory built on cunning, not corpses. This was not the kind of triumph that would be sung in parades or etched into medals. There were no glorious charges, no fields soaked in blood to photograph. Instead, it was quiet, invisible, a masterpiece of strategy that left the battlefield eerily intact. But history, she knew, would remember. 50,000 enemy soldiers, stripped of their will to fight, scattered into the wind overnight. It was the kind of story that would be studied by future commanders in dusty war colleges, dissected in lecture halls. A victory of intellect over brute force, and for her, that was enough. The dawn after the vanishing army broke differently. The valley, once choked with the dust and noise of an advancing war machine, now lay quiet as a graveyard. The only sounds were the cries of displaced animals and the creak of abandoned wagons. What had seemed impossible, outmaneuvering 50,000 men, was now fact. The generals who had laughed at her strategy hours earlier sat stiff-backed around the map table. Their medals glinted in the early light, but their confidence had dimmed. Not one dared make eye contact with her. "Explain this," one muttered finally, gesturing at the messenger who had just delivered another report of mass desertion. The man only shook his head. "There's nothing left to explain, sir. They're gone. Supplies abandoned. Convoys scattered. He hesitated, glancing at her. It's exactly as she predicted. The tent grew heavy with realization. Every arrogant dismissal, every whispered doubt about her competence, collapsed under the weight of undeniable proof. The SEAL commander, her sharpest critic and the loudest voice against her, stood slowly. His jaw clenched, his eyes lingering on the map where the enemy's pins had once crowded like an infestation. "I owe you an apology," he said at last, his voice low but carrying. The room stilled. Apologies were rarer than victories in this line of work. "I thought your strategy was naive, but you saved lives. You achieved in one night what we couldn't in months." Her gaze met his, calm and steady. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She only nodded once. "We don't win wars by numbers," she replied. "We win them by breaking the enemy's will before they break ours." The words lingered in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Out on the field, the younger recruits whispered about her with awe. They had seen the decoys, the sabotage, the controlled demolitions that had lit the night sky. They hadn't understood at first, but when the reports of an evaporated army reached their ears, the picture became clear. "She made them run without firing a shot," one said. 50,000, another repeated, as if the number itself was impossible to comprehend. When she walked among them, helmets tilted in subtle nods. No cheers, no chants, just quiet, unspoken respect. Captured officers spoke with wide eyes, their voices trembling as they recounted the night. "They had us surrounded," one insisted, even when told it was false. "We saw their lines everywhere. Our scouts reported armored divisions. How could so many men move so quickly?" Another simply shook his head. "We weren't fighting soldiers. We were fighting shadows. You can't defeat an enemy you can't see." Their testimony spread like wildfire through intelligence circles. Fear was a contagion, and her name was becoming synonymous with it. But victory, she knew, came with weight. Alone in her quarters, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. The world would celebrate the result, but only she understood the price of deception, the thin line between brilliance and failure. What if one saboteur had been caught? What if a single radio intercept had exposed her ruse? 50,000 men wouldn't have vanished. They would have descended like a tidal wave, crushing everything in their path. Strategy was never certainty. It was gamble, risk wrapped in discipline. And tonight she had won. But how many more gambles could she afford before luck ran out? In the official reports, the operation would be given a code name, its details locked behind classified seals for decades. But the whispers, those couldn't be contained. In hushed tones, soldiers called it the Night of Shadows. As the weeks turned into months, her name carried weight in ways it never had before. No longer the strategist or the outsider, she was spoken of as a commander whose mind could dismantle armies. And for the first time, even those who had doubted her fell silent when she entered a room. Not because of rank, but because of respect, earned the only way it ever could be in war, through results. They had mocked her for thinking differently, but in the end, her difference had saved them all. 50,000 enemies had vanished into the night, and with them vanished every doubt about the woman who turned shadows into victory.